I spent 20 years building a family, a career, a life that I believed was as solid as the foundations of the buildings I managed. I was wrong. In just one night, I discovered that the wife I trusted was the one digging my grave, and the close relative, a venomous snake, nestled in my own home. They didn't just want my money. They wanted to destroy everything, starting with my only daughter. They thought an old veteran like me would easily fall, but they forgot one basic thing about old soldiers. We never retreat. So, when you're backed into a corner by the very people you love most, what will you do to reclaim what's yours? I once believed the silence in my house was a sign of peace, something I traded my youth in the military for. But that Friday night, I realized silence can also be a shell, hiding silent, unfixable cracks. The call from the hospital came around 11 at night. Just as I finished the last blueprint at the construction site, a strange woman's voice, steady and professional, informed me that my daughter, Lyra, was in the emergency room. I didn't ask many questions, just said I'll be right there, and rushed to my car. The road from the construction site to Crestfall General Hospital had never felt so long. I walked into the emergency room and saw Lyra lying on a bed, her eyes closed, next to a continuously blinking heart monitor. Rosalind, my wife, sat beside her, her hand loosely holding our daughter's hand. She looked tired but strangely calm. Corbin. My wife looked up, her voice steady. Lyra fell. She came home unexpectedly and must have slipped on the back stairs. I looked at my daughter, then at Rosalind. Who brought her here? It was me and Damien, she replied as if it were the most obvious thing. Damien happened to be passing by. I panicked when I saw Lyra like that, so I asked him to help take her to the hospital. Damien Blackwood, the distant cousin who had moved to Crestfall a few years ago, a real estate professional with a polite demeanor and honeyed words. He was also the person I always felt was not right. Just then, a nurse walked in and asked Rosalind to step out to complete some paperwork. She stood up, gave me a quick glance, and left. It was just Lyra and me. I sat down in the chair Rosalind had left and gently touched my daughter's hand. Her eyes slowly opened, and when she recognized me, fear was evident in them. "I didn't fall, Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling and weak. Someone pushed me." She took a deep breath, as if trying to gather all her courage. "I came home to get something, and I heard Mom and Mr. Damien in the study. I couldn't hear clearly, but Mom called him my love, and he was talking about transferring money from the old account." Tears started to roll down her cheeks. I got scared and was about to turn back when someone grabbed me from behind on the back stairs. He held my mouth tight, and I could feel the smell of medicine on his hand. I couldn't breathe. Then he pushed me down the stairs and said, "Don't be nosy about things that aren't your business." My anger didn't flare up like fire. It was like a block of ice forming in my chest, cold and sharp. When Rosalind returned, followed by Damien with 2 cups of coffee, the play was ready. Damien handed me a cup, his face showing sincere concern. "It's a good thing we were here in time. She must have been overworking herself." Rosalind nodded in agreement. "Exactly. She's been studying so hard lately. She must have had a dizzy spell and imagined things." I looked directly into Damien's eyes, then at Rosalind. They acted too well. A worried mother, a kind relative. A perfect story about an unfortunate accident. But they didn't know that their wall of defense had a crack. My eyes slid down to Rosalind's hand resting on the bed rail. Her fingertips were unconsciously tapping lightly, a habit that only appeared when she was lying. I didn't say anything, just took a sip of the coffee. It was bitter. My military experience taught me never to let the enemy know what you know when facing them. That night, in the cold hospital hallway, I identified them. This was not a cheap affair. This was a warning, a deliberate act The game had begun, even though I hadn't chosen to start it. And from now on, I would set the rules. After that night at the hospital, our house became a silent stage. Rosalind continued to play the role of the caring wife, and Damien still occasionally visited with a worried look, asking about Lyra's health. They played their roles perfectly, but I had seen what was behind that velvet curtain. A few days later, I sat in my study, not to look at construction blueprints, but to review the pile of annual tax documents. It was an old habit, a way to keep everything in check. And that's when I saw it. A plot of land on the edge of town, a plot we had bought 5 years ago as an investment, was suddenly no longer listed as a joint asset. I put the tax return down on the table, feeling the coldness spread from my chest. That evening, while Rosalind was watching something on television, I walked over and placed the paper on the coffee table in front of her. "The land in Willow Creek," I said, my voice even. "Where is it?" Rosalind didn't take her eyes off the screen, just took a sip of wine. "Oh, that. I sold it. To reinvest in a more promising project." "Which project?" "Damien's. He has a very good plan," she replied, as casually as if she were talking about the weather. I looked straight at her. "I don't remember signing any sale documents." At this, Rosalind finally turned to look at me. A smile flashed across her lips. A smile I had never seen before. "You must have forgotten, Corbin. You've been so busy lately." I didn't say anything else, just picked up the paper and turned away. Arguing wasn't the solution. I needed the truth, not polished lies. The next morning, I didn't go to the construction site. I drove to the office of Nick Decker, my old comrade. Decker wasn't the type of lawyer you'd see advertised on television. His office was small, located on the second floor of an old building, and smelled strongly of thick coffee. But Decker knew the law, and more importantly, he understood me. I placed the notarized documents for the land on his desk. "Check this for me," especially the signature. Decker didn't ask many questions. He picked up his magnifying glass, which he always joked was his ultimate weapon, and carefully examined every stroke of ink. 15 minutes later, he looked up, pushing his glasses up. "It was done very professionally, Corbin," Decker said, his voice low. "The signature is very similar to yours, but there are a few inconsistent pressure points in the ink. The hand of a forger, no matter how skilled, cannot mimic the habits of a real person." He paused, looking me straight in the eye. "To put it simply, this is fake. And the notary who signed it was either grossly negligent or was persuaded." I nodded, not surprised. The block of ice in my chest seemed to solidify, becoming harder. I had the answer I needed. "So what's the next step?" Decker asked. "The next step," I said, standing up, "is to find out what Damien's promising project really is." The crack was no longer a suspicion. It had become a deep hole, and I knew, at the bottom of that hole, there were not only lies but much worse things. I didn't let Rosalind know about my discovery. In a war, you never let the enemy know you've seen through their plan. Instead, I watched. I listened to her whispered phone calls and noticed the documents she brought home and hastily hid in the safe. A week later, I decided it was time. Not for a fiery confrontation, but for a test. That evening, when it was just the two of us in the kitchen, I said casually, "Decker said there were a few problems with the sale of the Willow Creek land. Maybe we should review the paperwork." Rosalind was chopping vegetables, and the knife in her hand paused for a fraction of a second. Just a tiny moment, but enough for me to see. She didn't turn to look at me, just continued her work, her voice still steady. "That asset is a joint asset, Corbin. I handled it in the best way for our family. You're not always right, you know." That wasn't a denial. It was an admission, wrapped in defiance. She knew that I knew, and she didn't care. The next day, they made their move. I was at the construction site when I received a call from the company director. His voice was tense. "Corbin, there's an issue at Site B7. A scaffolding collapsed. 2 workers were slightly injured. The safety inspector is on their way." I rushed to the scene. The scaffolding hadn't completely collapsed. Only a small corner had fallen. But it was enough to cause trouble. 2 days later, a preliminary investigation report was submitted. Conclusion: there were signs of substandard materials being used. The testimony of a few workers, whom I had never trusted, said that they had seen me rushing the progress. Everything happened too quickly, too perfectly. A perfect trap. That same day, Damien began his actions. He didn't file an official lawsuit, but whispers started to spread in the Crestfall construction community that he had invested in my project and lost money due to my negligence. That Corbin Vance was no longer trustworthy. Within a week, everything fell apart. The parent company suspended me for the investigation. The smaller partners I was working with began to withdraw, citing concerns about reputation. My phone calls were no longer answered. The local police called me in, not as a witness but as a person of interest. I sat in my pickup truck, parked on a quiet street corner, looking at the lights of Crestfall. I had been isolated. They didn't just want money. They wanted to destroy my reputation, my career, everything I had built. They wanted to turn me into a nobody, someone no one would trust, someone with no voice. A cold anger surged within me. They had underestimated me. They thought I was just a simple construction manager. They had forgotten who I was and where I came from. They wanted an all-out war. Then they would have it. Being isolated doesn't mean being helpless. It just means you have to fight alone. I went to Decker, not at his office, but at a shabby bar in the suburbs where sad country music could hide any conversation. I put my beer down. "They want to bury me alive, Decker." Decker nodded, his face showing no surprise. "Their plan is well calculated. They're targeting your reputation, using the law as a weapon. You can't confront them directly." "I know," I replied. "So we won't confront them directly. We'll start a small fire in their own house." I explained my plan. Decker listened, occasionally taking a sip of his beer. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then a small smile appeared on his lips. "You're still you, Corbin. Always choosing the hardest path." Decker shook his head, but there was a look of admiration in his eyes. "But be careful. This time the enemy isn't wearing a uniform and they're not on the battlefield. They're right in your home." "I know," I replied, my voice unchanged. "That's why I have to end it. Decisively. It's the only way left," I said. A week later, the plan began. Decker had his own connections. One of them was a woman named Isabella, an old acquaintance. Sharp and good at acting, Isabella appeared at a charity fundraising event that I knew Damien would be at. She played the role of a new investor in town. Showing interest in his real estate projects, Damien, with his self-satisfied nature, immediately took the bait. 2 days later, Decker handed me an envelope. Inside were a few photos, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. The photos weren't overly dramatic. Just Damien chatting intimately with Isabella at a pub, one of his hands placed suggestively on her waist. They looked like a couple in the early stages of dating. That evening, an envelope with no return address was placed in our mailbox. I knew Rosalind had a habit of checking the mail every time she came home from work. The fire had been lit. I didn't see it flare up immediately, but I felt its heat. Dinners became quieter. Rosalind's phone calls became short and sharp. Occasionally, I heard her and Damien arguing in the study, the slammed doors unable to hide the tension. While they were busy with their own conflict, I delivered the second blow. Decker and I officially filed a lawsuit, accusing Rosalind of forging my signature on the transfer documents for the Willow Creek land. The lawsuit didn't target Damien, it named Rosalind specifically. The news spread quickly. A civil lawsuit. Not too loud, but enough to make the Crestfall business community whisper. Rosalind Vance. The woman who had always maintained a flawless image was now being sued by her own husband. And that's when I talked to Lyra. She had recovered a lot. She sat and listened to me explain the whole situation, her face becoming more determined. "So what do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice no longer trembling. "I need you to go to court," I said. "I don't need you to lie. Just tell the truth. About how your mom was often not home. About how you saw your mom and another man acting suspiciously." I looked straight into my daughter's eyes. "This is very difficult, Lyra. I'll understand if you don't want to." Lyra was silent for a long moment. Then she looked up, with the sharp gaze of a law student. "I'll do it," she said. "For the truth. And for you." The trap had been set. On one side, legal pressure from the court. On the other, suspicion and jealousy from the anonymous photos. Rosalind was caught in the middle. A person's limits, no matter how tough, will eventually break. And I would be there, waiting for that moment. My lawsuit was like a rock thrown into a calm lake. It didn't cause a tsunami, but its ripples spread throughout Crestfall. Rosalind, who had always been proud of her social status and spotless image, was for the first time facing whispers behind her back. She couldn't control it. The rift between Rosalind and Damien grew larger. Their arguments were no longer whispered behind closed doors. One evening, I heard her almost screaming on the phone. "You said everything was under control. Why are there these photos now? Why is my husband suing me?" I couldn't hear Damien's answer, but I could guess. He was starting to look for a way out. A court summons was sent. Rosalind had to appear. The pressure grew. She went to see Damien, probably to seek a solution, some support. But Damien wasn't an ally. He was an opportunist. They met at his office. I wasn't there. But later, Rosalind told me about it with extreme bitterness. She demanded that Damien take responsibility and resolve the lawsuit. But he just shrugged, his face cold and distant. "This is your family's problem, Rosalind," he said, his voice slick. "You chose this path. Don't drag me into it." To Damien, Rosalind was just a useful tool, and when that tool started to have problems, he was ready to discard it without pity. That was the moment she broke down, not because of losing money, not because of the lawsuit, but because of the betrayal from the person she had trusted, the person she had partnered with to go against her own husband. The humiliation, bitterness, and the realization that she was just a pawn in Damien's game completely destroyed her pride. Meanwhile, Decker and I delivered the next blow. It wasn't loud, just another anonymous letter. This time sent to the tax department. The letter contained a few hints about unusual financial transactions and shady money flows related to Blackwood real estate. We didn't need solid proof. We just needed to plant a seed of doubt in the right soil. A week later, Damien received a request to work from the tax agency. At this point, he was truly scared. A tax investigation was much more serious than a civil lawsuit. He went back to Rosalind, but not to comfort her, but to blame and threaten her. "Was it you?" he yelled at her. "What did you tell your husband? Now you have to take care of this. Use your money to shut them up." The conflict had reached its peak. Their ship wasn't just cracked, it was breaking into pieces. Damien, who had always appeared polite and in control, was now revealed as a cornered animal, ready to bite anyone, including his own accomplice. He was destroying everything himself, and I was simply standing from a distance, watching it all fall apart. The door to my study opened without a knock. Rosalind stood there, looking even worse than she did that night at the hospital. Gone was her neat appearance, her pride. All that was left was fatigue and desperation. "We need to talk, Corbin." I didn't look up from the pile of papers on my desk, just gestured for her to sit down. "I'm listening." She sat in the chair opposite me, her hands clasped tightly together. "You won," she said, her voice hoarse. "You got what you wanted. People are talking. Damien is like a mad dog, You can stop now. I haven't gotten what I wanted, I replied, finally looking up at her. What I want is the truth. Rosalind laughed, a dry, bitter laugh. The truth? You want the truth? Fine. And she started to talk. No more hiding, no more lies. Like a dam that had broken, everything poured out. She told me how she had helped Damien launder dirty money, and how they had planned to push me out of the family's financial picture. Regarding Damien's actions, she didn't have a perfect video like in the movies. But she had things that were even more real. She pushed a small notebook toward me. Inside were careful notes about the commission payments Damien had given her after each deal. And this too, she said, pulling a file from her handbag. It was copies of documents Damien had asked her to sign. Investment contracts with cunningly hidden unfavorable terms targeting other investors. Finally, she took a deep breath. And yes, her voice was almost a whisper. He was the one who bragged to me about how he had taught Lyra a lesson. He said the kid was too curious and needed to learn fear. He was also the one behind the scaffolding collapse. He said it was the fastest way to get rid of you. Her confession, as an insider, was the strongest evidence. She looked at me, her eyes no longer defiant, but pleading like a person about to drown. My motive isn't regret, Corbin. I want to get revenge on Damien. He abandoned me. Help me get out of this lawsuit, and I'll help you bury him. A proposal for a partnership. One last trump card. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the silent backyard. I had been waiting for this moment. The moment she completely lost control. You don't want revenge on him, Rosalind, I said, my voice calm, without turning around. You're just trying to find another life raft. But this ship has already sunk. I don't need your help to bury him, I said, without turning around. He's burying himself. I turned back and looked straight into the eyes of the woman who used to be my wife. This is my condition. You sign all the divorce papers. Give up all joint assets. Remove your name from all companies, all trusts. End everything. In return, I continued, my voice cold as ice. I won't pursue criminal charges for your signature forgery. And what you just said will stay in this room. Desperation was evident on Rosalind's face. She had gambled everything on the last hand and lost. You're taking everything from me, she stammered. No, I replied. I'm just taking back what you tried to take from me. You took everything from yourself. Cornered, with no way back, Rosalind nodded, a weak nod, marking her complete collapse. The chess game had finally reached checkmate. The signing happened quickly. Our marriage was officially over. No one shed a tear. That evening, I sat alone in my study, looking at the thick file on my desk. Everything was almost done. But an image of Rosalind signing the papers, a fleeting despair in her eyes, flashed in my mind. I wondered, was stopping here enough? Would her downfall and Damien's disgrace bring true peace? Then I thought of Lyra, of her panicked face at the hospital. The answer came to me on its own. This wasn't revenge. This was justice for my daughter. I picked up the phone and called Decker. We're continuing. I reclaimed most of the misappropriated assets. The land in Willow Creek, the investments, the house. I transferred a significant portion into a trust in Lyra's name. It wasn't a gift, but a layer of protection for her future. A fortress that no one could invade. Lyra, despite the heartbreak of the truth about her mother, was by my side the whole time. She reviewed every contract, handled small legal issues with the sharpness of a real lawyer. The shock didn't break her. On the contrary, it made her stronger and more determined. But I didn't stop there. My promise to Rosalind was only to remain silent about her role. I never promised to leave Damien alone. Decker and I sat down together, reviewing the evidence Rosalind had provided. The notebook with the commission notes, the fraudulent contracts. They were the perfect ammunition. Send it to the police? Decker asked. No. I shook my head. Court justice is for punishment. Battlefield justice is to ensure the enemy can never get back up again. He won't go to jail for a few years and come out to start over. He must be destroyed by the very people he trampled on. I had a different plan, a more direct one. Decker, with his network, found a list of small-time investors Damien had defrauded in previous projects, people who had lost everything, who had bitterly given up because they couldn't fight against someone with so many tricks. We packaged the evidence. Not all of it, just the parts directly related to each victim. Copies of their own contracts with the fraudulent terms circled, a few pages from Rosalind's notebook showing how much money Damien had received from that fraud. Anonymous envelopes were sent out again. This time, it wasn't just whispers. A real storm had erupted. A class action lawsuit was initiated. Dozens of people, armed with new evidence, stood together against Damien. The local press began to get involved. The name Damien Blackwood was no longer associated with success, but with fraud and deceit, with a tax investigation, lawsuits from former partners, and frozen accounts. Damien had no way to do business. He was forced to sell everything he had left to try to make restitution, to avoid a prison sentence. The last I heard of him, he was leaving Crestfall in a cheap car, his face haggard, his eyes panicked. He wasn't killed. He wasn't immediately imprisoned, but he had lost everything: money, reputation, and the freedom to live a normal life. His future was a series of days facing lawsuits and being pursued by the people he had cheated. It was a life sentence in a different way. As for Rosalind, true to our agreement, she disappeared. She left town, cut off all contact, becoming a name in the past. A ghost of betrayal. I stood in my house, now truly silent. There was no gloating of a victor, just a feeling of relief bordering on emptiness, like successfully removing a tumor that had deeply embedded itself in my body. The war was over. Now it was time to clean up the battlefield. Life doesn't have clear endings like in the movies. There's no the end title card running across the screen. After the storm, things don't go back to how they were. They become something else. I didn't go back to my old company. I used part of my capital to rent a small office in the center of town and opened a construction consulting firm. I didn't take on big projects, just houses and small shops for ordinary people in Crestfall. The work didn't bring in much money, but it was real. It was solid. And it was mine. Our house also gradually changed. The tension disappeared, replaced by an awkward quietness, which slowly became pleasant. Lyra stayed with me. She didn't talk much about her mother. The pain was still there, but she didn't let it define her. She excelled in her final year of law school. I'm coming back to Crestfall to work, she told me one evening at dinner. This place needs good lawyers to help protect people who have been betrayed, just like you. I looked at my daughter and saw a determination in her eyes that I had never seen before. The storm had taken her innocence, but it had given her a purpose. One Sunday afternoon in late autumn, with golden leaves falling all over the yard, I decided to clean out the storage room. It was filled with old memorabilia, things we had accumulated over 20 years. In the back corner, I found a wooden box. Inside were old family photos. A photo of Lyra on her first day of school. A photo of the whole family on a beach trip many years ago. Rosalind was laughing, her smile so radiant back then. I looked at the face of the woman in the photo, trying to find a familiar feeling, but I couldn't. That person was dead, or perhaps never truly existed. I didn't throw away the photo box. I didn't burn it either. The hatred had cooled, leaving only scars. I calmly closed the lid of the box, locked it with a small lock, and put it on the highest shelf. The past needed to be sealed, not to be forgotten, but so that it no longer had the power to hurt the present. I walked out of the storage room, squinting against the slanted light of the sunset filtering through the trees. Lyra was sitting on the back porch, holding a thick law book. She looked up, saw me, and smiled. A genuine smile. "Do you want some coffee?" she asked. "Yes, please," I replied, sitting down on the chair next to her, while Lyra went inside to make coffee. I suddenly remembered what Decker had told me last week, that someone had seen Rosalind working somewhere far away. A different life. A different person. I wondered if she ever thought about it, but then I pushed the thought away. It no longer mattered. Lyra came back with 2 hot cups of coffee. We sat there in a comfortable silence, looking towards the mountains that were slowly changing colors in the twilight. A small town. An old house. A man who had weathered the storm. I didn't win gloriously, but I didn't fall. And perhaps that was the most important victory. I once thought my career and assets were the most solid foundations. Now I realized that the real foundation was sitting right here, next to me, with a smile and a hot cup of coffee. The darkness had gradually receded. Not completely, but enough for the light to shine through. And for me right now, that was enough.